conformément à l'article 67.1 du règlement, il y aurait maintenant une période de questions de 30 minutes. I invite honourable members to rise in their place. We'll begin. L'honorable député de Gaspésie-le-Madeleine.
Merci, M. le Président, et bienvenue tout le monde à la 36e fois qu'on invoque l'attribution de temps. C'est un record. Il faut vraiment se poser la question comment ce gouvernement-là peut justifier d'invoquer encore une autre fois l'attribution du temps. Si je pourrais citer le premier ministre lui-même qui a dit en octobre 2002, il a dit en Chambre, en soulevant le nombre de fois que les libéraux y ont invoqué l'attribution de temps, il a dit, et je cite, « The government has used closure and time allocation more frequently than any previous government. » Alors nous voilà avec un gouvernement qui a même battu le record que M. Harper a dénoncé il y a une dizaine d'années. Je peux citer le professeur Ned Franks, un expert dans le domaine constitutionnel. Monsieur Ned Franks nous a dit un petit peu plus tôt cette année qu'aucun gouvernement dans l'histoire du Canada a invoqué l'attribution du temps à la fréquence que ce gouvernement a fait. C'est un record, Monsieur le Président, et c'est carrément antidémocratique. J'aimerais citer encore une fois notre premier ministre qu'en Chambre, en 2002, le 9 décembre 2002, il a dit que le gouvernement libéral dans le temps, et si je peux continuer en anglais, la citation est en anglais, « The government invoked closure because there are no plans. » Il a ajouté « because the government is simply increasingly embarrassed by the state of the debate and it needs to move on. » Je pense que c'est tout à fait semblable à la situation qu'on a aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président. Les conservateurs, ils ont tellement honte de ce qui se passe à l'autre bord au Sénat que je pense qu'ils veulent vraiment se débarrasser du débat le plus vite possible et finalement fermer la Chambre une fois pour toutes. C'est carrément antidémocratique, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais souligner le fait que quand on invoque l'attribution du temps, on n'a pas la chance d'avoir une discussion pleine et entière sur les projets de loi qu'on a devant nous. Le C-38, c'est un excellent exemple où on a changé tellement de projets de loi que le gouvernement n'arrête pas à chasser des lapins pour essayer de régler les trous qui n'ont pas réglé dans le temps, faute de débat nécessaire. Je pense, par exemple, le fait que la loi sur les pêches a été changée pour redéfinir la définition de la protection d'habitat de poissons. Même le mois passé, le département de pêche et océan demandait aux intéressés à travers le Canada de, s'il vous plaît, les aider à définir ce qui est la protection de l'habitat du poisson, parce qu'ils ne savaient pas eux-mêmes. Si on aurait eu un débat l'année passée sur le C-38, ça aurait eu de l'allure, on aurait eu une réponse. Invoquer l'attribution du temps, c'est antidémocratique, puis ça crée des lois qui sont pourries, qu'il faut finalement envoyer à la Cour suprême. C'est vraiment du gaspillage, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Merci, M. le Président, et merci, mon collègue, pour engager sur ce débat sur un sujet, à mon avis, qui est très important, et c'est le patrimoine de notre pays, le patrimoine du Canada, et la création de nouveaux musées canadiens de l'histoire. Et j'aimerais juste souligner ce qu'on est en train de débattre ici maintenant. C'est le nouveau mandat et la création de nouveaux musées ici dans la capitale nationale, le Musée canadien de l'histoire. Et on parle dans ce projet de loi de nouveau mandat qui est tout simplement, je cite, le nouveau mandat du Musée canadien de l'histoire d'accroître la connaissance, la compréhension et le degré d'appréciation des Canadiens à l'égard d'événements, d'expériences, de personnes et d'objets qui incarnent l'histoire et l'identité canadienne qui l'ont façonné, ainsi que de les sensibiliser à l'histoire du monde et aux autres cultures. Voilà ce qu'on est en train de faire, c'est d'établir un musée ici, la capitale nationale du Canada, qui va établir une vraie infrastructure autour du Canada pour le patrimoine de notre pays et pour renforcer la connaissance de notre patrimoine comme pays. In the creation of the Canadian Museum of History, Mr. Speaker, I certainly would like to point out the broad support that we have for this initiative. It should be pointed out that the Mayor of Gatineau, Mr. Bureau, he supports the creation of this museum. Mr. Watson, the Mayor of Ottawa, he supports the creation of this museum. As do historians and museum directors from all across this country who are supporting this initiative. I would just point out, for example, John McCavity, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian Museums Association. He says, quote, "The renaming of the museum is essential. This is good news. It will give Canadians greater access to their heritage and to their history." Michael Bliss, also a historian and an author, he said, quote, "It's very exciting that Canada's major museum will now be explicitly focused on Canada's history." These are all important initiatives, spokespeople for Canada's history, the understanding of Canada's history, who are excited about this legislation, Bill C-49, the new focus of Canada's largest museum, and moving forward so that Canadians can have this national infrastructure for the teaching, dissemination, and future study of Canada's history.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is something in which we are seeing far too often from this Conservative Reform majority government. It's an attitude, Mr. Speaker. We have now had 36 times in which this government, this majority government, has abused the legislature in this form of bringing in a closure. And that's what time allocation is, Mr. Speaker. The government is saying that members of Parliament that were duly elected are not going to be afforded the opportunity to thoroughly debate legislation. 36 times is a record in terms of the history of our nation. And it is something in which this government should not be saying hear, hear to. This is not a badge of honor. It is a disgrace and a slap in the face of democracy. It's a style of governance which is just not acceptable for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We should not be taking for granted the system that we have in place, Mr. Speaker. This is something in which the government should be allocating more time to. We should be allowing and fostering democracy, Mr. Speaker, not bringing in time allocation on every piece of legislation. That's not a tool, Mr. Speaker, that should be used on every occasion. Every government of every political stripe, even you Democrats at the provincial level, have used different forms of time allocation when it was deemed necessary. It's not necessary on all pieces of legislation. My question to the government is, why has this government time and time again used closure as a means to pass legislation when, in fact, Mr. Speaker, that is not a good way of governance? What we have seen is an abusive, conservative, reform government taking advantage of trying to pass legislation through time allocation, which is just wrong.
Eric.
The Honourable Minister.
Again, the problem with that, of course, is that our government, we actually moved forward to expand the time that the House can consider legislation, to have the House sit until midnight, and the opposition parties voted against that. So they're opposed to what he's prescribing, and then we take an alternative track. He's against that as well. Look, we announced our plan to create the Canadian Museum of History in the second week of October of last year. This is nothing new. We've had, I thought it was actually a very good debate. The leader of the Green Party spoke to this legislation. The member for Bonavista Gander Grand Falls spoke to this legislation. I know the NDP spoke to it as well. And actually, I thought we had a very good, very thorough debate. All sides represented. I was pleased to answer questions. I'm looking actually forward to going to the parliamentary committee to talking about this legislation and what it means and being able to answer in more than 30-second sound bites like we have in question period, but to actually have a thorough conversation about what it is that we plan to do with this institution and how it'll benefit all Canadians, not just the national capital. So look, we're very excited to be going forward with this. We think it's in the best interest of this country. There's, of course, limited time on the parliamentary calendar. We've extended the time that the House of Commons can sit at night. Looking forward to having this legislation debated at committee, and let's move forward and support a great institution.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's not only that the members of the opposition try to close down debate as well. We've been here twice, 2 nights, and at 9:30 at night they've been too tired to sit here and work past 9:30, so they try and close down debate. More importantly, the member for Winnipeg North consistently gets up and talks about reform, conservative, as though we should somehow be ashamed of the fact that there are members on this side of the House who have been elected as reform members, as alliance members, as progressive conservatives, and then conservatives, some of them 7 times, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you what, we're actually proud of those people and the millions of Canadians who voted for them. Unlike the Liberal Party, who suggests that somehow these millions of Canadians are stupid, that they don't deserve the quality representation they've had from the Reform, the Canadian Alliance, the Progressive Conservative, and the Conservatives, who now form the best government this country has ever had, Mr. Speaker. Again and again and again, The Liberals, what they do is insult the West, and that's why they're a rump of insignificant nobodies in this House, Mr. Speaker. My actual question, though, to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, the best Minister of Canadian Heritage we ever had, is how important is this legislation? Not only how important is this legislation to communities across this country, to small museums across this country, and just to reiterate just how important arts and culture is to this country, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for my colleague, and indeed, as the start of his question, I am proud. I'm a proud former staffer of Preston Manning, and I was elected as a Canadian Alliance MP, and I'm pleased to see that we've all been able to move forward, build our party, and to be at a position here where we are able to put forward legislation and to build national institutions of national significance, like creating a Canadian Museum of History. On his specific question about the importance of what this museum will mean to all museums across the country, you know, Deborah Morrison said it very well. She is, of course, the head of Canada's History Society, and she said this. She said, quote, "The potential for this museum to create a national framework for our history is compelling. The time to do this is right." What she's referring to about the time being right is that we are now, of course, just a few years away from 2017, Canada's 150th birthday. And these moments don't come by often, of course, for many countries in the world. And having a sesquicentennial on the horizon is an opportunity for us to work together, to build national institutions, and to be proud of them, and to be proud of the work that they can do, again, not only to build up the presence of great institutions in the great capital of the city of Ottawa and Gatineau in the region here, but also, more importantly, I think, is to give a shot in the arm, a boost of financing, institutional pan-Canadian support to all the museums across the country. That's what this institution will do, and that's why, as I said, we have broad-based support from across this country. Former Liberal Member of Parliament and biographer Pierre Trudeau said, quote, "Congratulations on the Canadian Museum of History. This is a great boost for the museum." These are people, again, who are not typically conservatives or reformers or Canadian Alliance supporters, but who are Canadians who can see the bigger picture, who can put partisanship aside and actually work with other people to support the creation of great institutions.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. Il reste seulement 18 minutes. Je veux que les questions soient être environ 1 minute et les réponses le même temps. Honorable député de Gatineau.
Évidemment, la minute commence à moi. C'est le fun. Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est un cadeau un petit peu empoisonné. J'écoutais le ministre avec attention, outre le fait que, franchement, sur une question de musée, je pense que ce n'est pas une question de vie ou de mort. Ce n'est pas comme si le musée était en danger d'extinction de quelque nature que ce soit ou de quelque façon que ce soit. C'est un musée qui fonctionne très bien. Et dans ma région, parce que je suis quand même député de Gatineau, même s'il est du côté de Hull-Elmer, il y a beaucoup de problèmes avec cette modification-là, beaucoup d'interrogations. Et il faut faire attention quand on en beurre épais sur le dos des maires. Les maires sont peut-être bien contents de recevoir cette annonce de 25 millions de dollars, mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'ils n'ont pas les mêmes interrogations que leurs électeurs, à savoir qu'en est-il de ce changement de mission, de ce changement de vocation. Mais là où j'en ai, c'est quand le ministre nous dit qu'il faut que maintenant, on ait encore une fois une motion d'attribution de temps. Et j'ai finalement compris, à cause de son secrétaire parlementaire, qui nous dit que dans le fin fond, c'est parce qu'ils ne sont pas intéressés à écouter ce qu'on a à dire. Alors, bravo pour la démocratie. Je suis extrêmement outrée et je pense que même le Preston Manning se revirait de bord, bout pour bout, parce qu'il y en a un qui croyait dans la liberté d'expression. C'était bien lui. Mais la question que je veux poser au ministre, c'est beau le Musée des civilisations, mais dans ce contexte-ci, je me demande si le ministre pourrait peut-être nous faire un petit compte-rendu sur le Musée des sciences et technologies qui devait s'en venir vers Hull parce qu'ils ont besoin de plus d'espace. Alors, quand on croit des musées, il ne faut pas y aller juste à la pièce.
L'honorable ministre du Patrimoine.
Bien, très intéressant ce que mon collègue dit. Bien, écoutez, on a déjà créé le nouveau musée canadien de la droit de la personne à Winnipeg. On a créé le nouveau musée d'immigration canadien à Halifax, à Pied 21. On est en train maintenant de créer un nouveau musée de l'histoire du Canada. Mais elle dit, bien, on ne veut pas celle-là, on veut une autre. On veut celui de sciences et technologies. Bien, donc, voyons donc ce qu'on peut faire. On est en train de créer 3 nouveaux musées, mais ce n'est pas celui-là, ni celui-là, mais c'est celui-là qu'on veut. Écoutez, on fait notre mieux dans un temps de crise économique. On est le seul gouvernement de G8 qui a augmenté notre investissement et financement dans nos musées nationaux. Et nous sommes en train de créer un nouveau musée qui est très important, certainement pour tout le Canada. I agree with her. I agree with the beginning of what she did say. You know, she said that the Museum of Civilization isn't falling apart and it isn't in a crisis. It's true. I've never said that. But what we ought to do is take advantage of this opportunity as we head towards our sesquicentennial and to build a pan-Canadian network that starts with the Jewel here in the National Capital and bind all of our museums across the country together. Nobody can argue that the Toronto Star is a broadsheet for the Conservative movement. But here's what they said about the creation of this museum. They said, quote, "It was welcome to hear that the government is announcing the rebranding of the Canadian Museum of Civilization as the Canadian Museum of History. Canada's history should be celebrated in this revamped museum. This is a good effort." Mr. Speaker, this is what we're trying to do. Work with other people, and she said the importance of working with others. I agree, which is why before we tabled this legislation, I reached out to my critic opposite, I reached out to the leader of the Green Party, I reached out to the member of the Liberal Party to get their support for this. We've tried to approach this the same way that we approached Pier 21 and the Human Rights Museum, which is we had quick debate, everybody saw the big picture, we worked together and got it done, and we're going to get it done in this museum as well.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Thunder Bay, Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a high regard for this minister in his sincere appreciation of the arts and his working hard for the arts. That's been clear to me many times. I am scratching my head over this bill. I'm undecided about it. So after those kudos to this minister, I really do want to learn more, hear more about this particular bill, because I'm not yet persuaded that it's the right direction to go. I don't really understand the motivation. While I trust him, I'm not sure that the bigger picture is healthy here. I also just want to go on record as once again saying this unbelievable number of closures on debates in this House just has to stop. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Well, I hope my honourable colleague, and thank you for the kind words, and look, I do hope that he is persuaded in the end to support this legislation and to move forward. And just so he's clear, this legislation changes. It's a short bill. It's not a tough read, but of course, the consequences of things aren't always measured by the size of a piece of legislation. But the new mandate of the museum is very simple. It's very clear. It says, quote, "The purpose of the museum is to, quote, enhance Canadians' knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of events, experiences, people, and objects that reflect and have shaped Canada's history and identity, and also to enhance their awareness of world history and cultures." That's a pretty simple mandate. There's nothing ideological about that. I think it's pretty straightforward, and I would encourage my colleague, if he wants to sit down and chat with me, I'd be more than glad. The more members of Parliament who support this bill, it would be great. We want this to be something that all people can get behind and support and move forward with it. So I'd be glad to give him a briefing, and I think that he would find as well, I know the people of Thunder Bay have some great cultural institutions as well, cultural institutions for which my colleague has been a great champion, I know, and I think that they would certainly benefit from the opportunity to access the 3.5 million items that are in the collection of the Canadian Museum, soon to be hopefully Canadian Museum of History. 3.5 million items in the collection, 90% of which are sitting in storage, not accessed. We want museums in his riding and mine and others across the country to develop their own narratives about Canadian history, access to this collection, and share Canada's history with all Canadians, not just have it all here in the National Capital.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. Honorable député de Ottawa-Vanier.
Merci, Mr. President. It's more of a comment than a question. I may have a question tonight when we get into the debate about the bill itself, but the comment, Mr. Speaker, is the following. I was reading this morning that under his leadership, Prime Minister Louis Saint-Laurent got into trouble on the pipeline debate when they invoked closure for the first time in that particular parliament. And it led in part to the defeat of his government later on. I remember when previous Liberal governments have also introduced closures. At some point, Mr. Speaker, I actually voted against such measures because I thought that it was not appropriate and it was against the spirit of democracy, the spirit of this House, especially when there was no strong valid reason and urgency to do so. And now I'm into this 41st Parliament, and I can't recall which significant legislation we've been able to deal with without closure. And I think that is a terrible way of conducting oneself and one's government in any parliament in this country.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, look, it's a fair comment, and obviously we'll have a vote shortly on this matter, and if my colleague wants to vote against closure, that's certainly his prerogative, but as he also mentioned, that previous Liberal governments and New Democrat governments on the provincial side use the tools at their disposal to move the country forward in a way that they think helps. And look, I'm here to advocate on behalf of the museum because I think it's good, and I think my honourable colleague from the National Capital would see the benefit of this, not only creating a great new institution here in the National Capital. By the way, Canadian Museum of Civilization hasn't been updated since 1980. When you go through the Canada Hall, which is supposed to be the narrative of Canada's history, it doesn't include Aboriginal Canadians. Kind of a problem. And there's a very, I think, stern and short and inadequate reflection on Acadian Canadians and their facts through Canada's history and what they've experienced. I mean, there are a number of things in the museum that need to be updated. This is also not just a change in mandate and name, but also an investment of $25 million into not only this museum, but creating this pan-Canadian network. So I think it'll be good for my honourable colleague. He can express his views certainly on the approach of the government when it comes to taking action, but I think the action itself is something that should have broad-based support, including from the honourable colleague.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. En fait, ce que j'aimerais avoir, c'est un éclairage parce que j'ai l'impression que le débat qu'on devrait avoir présentement en est un sur l'allocation de temps, donc sur une question de procédure. Alors que ce que j'observe depuis déjà quelques jours, c'est qu'on profite de ce temps-là pour parler du projet de loi du côté des conservateurs comme si on utilisait cette demi-heure pour une pub. D'ailleurs, si je fais le compte, ça fait au moins 4 allocations de temps qu'on débat depuis à peine une semaine, ce qui finalement vient couper 2 heures de débat sur des projets de loi qu'on aurait pu faire avancer pour discuter de procédures dont on ne discute pas non plus puisqu'on s'en sert pour faire une immense infopub. Alors, ma question est très simple. Est-ce qu'on pourrait revenir aux procédures de la Chambre habituelles et accepter une allocation de temps quand c'est une mesure d'exception et qui est justifiée? Et à date, j'oserais dire, si on pouvait émettre une pénalité financière à toutes les fois que les conservateurs utilisent l'allocation de temps, je crois qu'on aurait réglé le problème du déficit.
L'honorable ministre.
Écoutez, M. le Président, je comprends les préoccupations qui étaient soulignées par mon collègue et c'est vrai. Chaque fois que j'ai l'opportunité de parler un petit peu de l'histoire du Canada et l'importance de l'histoire du Canada et, à mon avis, l'importance de cette institution, je prends ce moment-là de discuter. Certainement, on va avoir beaucoup de discours, je suis certain, autour des procédures à la Chambre des communes, mais également, à mon avis, l'histoire du Canada, le patrimoine du Canada est quelque chose que je tiens très, très proche de mon cœur et je crois que c'est important, un sujet très important de parler. Et, je suis content et fier de ce projet de loi et j'espère qu'on va avoir l'appui de ceux et celles qui sont en faveur de ce projet de loi. Et je devrais dire également, Monsieur le Président, qu'on a annoncé ce projet de loi sur le 12 octobre 2012 et c'était le 11 octobre 2012, avant qu'on a mis sur table même ce projet de loi, que l'NPD s'est annoncé contre ce projet de loi, même avant qu'ils ont lu le nouveau mandat pour le musée. Alors, si on veut démontrer un peu de respect pour la Chambre des communes et les procédures, laissons-nous, avant qu'on déclare nos positions, lire les projets de loi, premièrement.
Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very quickly, I know some of my other colleagues want a chance to do this, but I agree with my colleague from Ottawa, Vanier, talks about the allocation and time allocation. You know, when we discussed issues within this bill, there's a lot of subtext here, and the subtext pertains to stuff that is under the legislation, such as the issue of sharing material across the country that would be normally of the Museum of Civilization, or in this case, the Canadian Museum of History. It would be nice, I mean, there are a lot of members here from different parts of the country would like to understand how this is going to work and have the ability to question that within this House with the legislation. Now, naturally, you can follow up with the bureaucrats, that sort of deal, like we normally do as parliamentarians, but you certainly can't do that now because the legislation is not passed yet. So it would be not, I'm not saying that this debate goes on forever, but I certainly would like a little bit more information as to how this is going to be implemented, and I'm certainly sure the minister, who seems to be quite sincere about it, would do it. Because one of the questions I have is about the motion that was brought to the House studying Canadian history, which was alarming in this fact that it was very prescriptive in what it does, very narrow in certain areas. It caused concern here, certainly. We also heard from the parliamentary secretary said earlier. Now, I don't know why they would do that within the context of this committee and disrupt a lot of stuff, because now we have the same sort of questions for the museum, which we would like to get answered. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Let me touch on the one subject that he raised while we have the time, and I'm again pleased to talk to my colleague outside of the House anytime, and we'll have a discussion at committee as well. Specifically on the issue that he raised, because I know that it's one that he's, not to portray a private conversation, but one that he's particularly interested in, which is the sharing of collections between museums. It's not something that you prescribe in legislation. It's not the place to do it. Where those partnerships are found are in the MOUs, the Memorandums of Understanding between the National Museum and the regional museums. One of those has been signed. We have others that are lined up and prepared to be signed in the future. The Royal BC Museum in Victoria, fantastic institution. They've signed an MOU with the National Museum. Again, that's the kind of thing, it's interesting. The conspiracy theorists who would argue that the government isn't trying to create an institution to tell its own narrative. No, the point is the Museums Act very clearly, in Section 27(1) of the Museums Act, makes it clear the government can't prescribe the narrative in any museum in the country, as it should be. So the MOUs that are signed between the museum and the regional museums is for them to decide, devoid of politics and politicians saying that certain things should or shouldn't be shared with other museums. So they can decide their own narratives, they sign the MOUs, and they work on this partnership. When we take this legislation to committee, I know that the president of the museum, Mark O'Neill, will be brought in. He's already done an exhaustive research on this subject matter, reached out to museums all across this country, signed an MOU already. We have more that are lined up to be signed. And I think the process you'll find, not only from the national perspective, but from local museums' perspective, has been one of openness and sharing with them the collections that they find most useful for the decisions that they want to make locally.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Longueuil-Pierre-Boucher.
Merci,
Seulement
Monsieur le
une
Président.
minute.
Alors moi, j'ai pas de problème du tout avec le roll-out de l'opération. J'ai pas de problème du tout avec la description qu'on en fait actuellement des projets futurs. La collaboration avec les autres musées, c'est très bien. Mais j'ai par contre un énorme problème avec le fait qu'on est à notre 36e bâillon sur un projet pareil et que notre ministre a le culot de nous demander d'avoir confiance. Avec tous les abus qu'on a pu voir, avec les campagnes, cet aspect très fidèle à une tradition qui, pour le moins, ne fait pas l'unanimité dans la population. Tout le monde a trouvé que c'était exagéré. Et aujourd'hui, on nous demande d'avoir confiance, alors qu'encore une fois, précisément, on nous coupe la parole sur ce sujet-là. Comment oser dire qu'on a assez consulté les gens, quand franchement, lorsque nous étions en comité sur le 150e anniversaire du Canada, on a clairement dit qu'il fallait que ce soit quelque chose que la population puisse s'imbriquer dedans, alors que très clairement, on sait que vous aviez déjà fait vos plans à l'avance. Alors, je vous demanderais simplement, vous me parlez de respect, alors que la semaine passée, lorsque j'ai fait mon discours...
Lloyd. Je demande encore une fois que vous dirigez vos questions, vos commentaires à la chaise, pas l'un à l'autre. L'honorable ministre du Patrimoine.
Oui, merci beaucoup, M. le Président. J'ai juste répondu à cette même question de mon collègue de l'NPD également sur ce dossier. But look, my honorable colleague says that that members of this House, on all sides, of course he's saying to the government, but I think it's a message that he's saying to members of all sides of this House, that we should all show greater respect for the parliamentary process, greater respect for democracy in this House. Okay, then why is it that when our government tabled this legislation on October 12th of 2012, the NDP had already said on October 11th, 2012, that they were going to vote against this legislation before they'd even read it. They hadn't read the legislation, hadn't seen the new mandate, hadn't spoken to me, hadn't spoken to anybody about this museum, what we had in mind and the approach that we're taking. Had they just held their fire on rabid partisanship and just talked to us and talked to this long list of people who are not conservatives who are supporting this legislation because they see the value in this institution, I think they would find themselves an opportunity to contribute much more reasonably to the establishment of a national institution that will benefit all Canadians, rather than just saying they're opposed to legislation before they've read it. You know, respecting this House isn't just a question of free votes in Parliament or committee structure or closure. You know, parliamentary freedom and responsibility and demonstrating respect for this House also should include reading legislation before you decide on how you're going to vote on it.
We have 1 minute. 30-second question, 30-second answer. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Heritage said earlier that I had spoken to this bill earlier. In point of fact, I've not been allowed to give an actual speech. I've only been allowed to ask a question. In the use of that question, I was able to signal that I'd come to the conclusion I was going to support this bill. But all of these closures mean that members in my position are never able to speak on the substance of the bill in more than 30 seconds.
The Honourable Minister, you have 30 seconds.
Turns out the same way for me, I suppose, at this moment. But look, I understand her frustration. I think members of Parliament should be able to speak, more frequently on legislation. I think it's great. For example, in these coming few weeks, if the Parliament sits until midnight, I see nothing wrong with that. I'd like to see the House sit more often, so more members of Parliament can express their views, raise their grievances, vent their frustrations, speak their hopes, and represent their constituents. I think it'd be a good thing, and I agree with my honourable colleague on the ability for MPs to speak more frequently on legislation.
Ça, c'est la fin du période de questions et commentaires. La question est la suivante.